The fire in Josiah Mercer's cabin had been burning for 5 straight days without a single log added, and the 3 trappers standing in his doorway couldn't believe what they were seeing. Outside, the Montana winter of 1842 held temperatures at 20 below zero, cold enough to kill a man in hours if he lost his heat source. Inside Josiah's small log structure, the air was warm enough that he worked in his shirt sleeves, tending a circular ring of bricks on his cabin floor, where red coals glowed with patient, unwavering heat. What those trappers witnessed that January morning would spread through the Rocky Mountain trapping community like wildfire, solving one of the deadliest problems every mountain man faced and saving dozens of lives over the next decade. Before we dive into how Josiah discovered this technique, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories of frontier innovation and survival against impossible odds speak to you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable discovery from the 1800s. Ezra Dalton pushed open the door to Josiah Mercer's cabin without knocking, which was standard practice among trappers in the Montana wilderness. Behind him, Levi Ashford and Micah Sterling stomped snow from their boots, their breath forming clouds in the frigid January air. All 3 men stopped just inside the threshold, staring at something they had never seen before in any mountain cabin they had visited. Josiah looked up from where he knelt beside a circular arrangement of bricks on his cabin floor. He was in his shirt sleeves despite the brutal cold outside. The cabin felt warm, genuinely warm, not the barely tolerable temperature most trappers endured during winter months. But what caught the visitors' attention was the fire itself, or rather, what appeared to be the absence of one. There were no flames, no burning logs, no smoke billowing from fresh wood, added to a hungry fire. Instead, within the brick circle that measured roughly 3 feet across, a bed of coals glowed deep red and orange. The coals were arranged in a specific pattern, denser in the center and spreading outward in what looked like deliberate placement. A few pieces of what appeared to be charcoal sat at the edges, not burning with flame but radiating steady heat. Ezra moved closer, the heat from the coal bed noticeable even at 5 feet away. "How long has this been burning?" he asked. Josiah used an iron rod to adjust one of the charcoal pieces slightly. 5 days, he said. "Same coal bed. I add a few small pieces morning and evening, adjust the airflow with these stones here, but the core has been burning since Sunday." The 3 trappers exchanged glances. Levi spoke next. "That's not possible. No fire burns 5 days without feeding it real wood." "It's not burning wood," Josiah explained, gesturing to the pile of black uniform pieces stacked near the wall. "That's charcoal. Burns slower, hotter, and keeps coals alive for days if you manage it right." Micah crouched down, extending his hands toward the heat. "Every trapper I know wakes up 3-4 times a night to feed his fire. Most mornings the cabin's near frozen anyway." "You're telling me you sleep through the night and wake up warm?" Josiah nodded. "I check it twice a day. Takes maybe 5 minutes. The brick ring holds heat, the charcoal burns slow, and if you control how much air gets to the coals, you can make them last near a week." Ezra walked around the fire ring, studying the construction. The bricks were laid in 2 courses, creating a circular wall. Flat stones sat partially across the top in strategic positions, clearly placed to restrict airflow. The entire system looked deliberate, engineered, nothing like the haphazard fireplaces most mountain men built. "This seems like a lot of trouble," Ezra said, though his tone suggested he was impressed despite himself. "Building this ring, making all that charcoal. Why not just cut more firewood?" Josiah's expression changed, becoming more serious. "Because 3 years ago my partner Aaron froze to death in a cabin with a full woodpile stacked outside. The fire went out while we slept. I've been working on this problem ever since." The cabin fell silent except for the faint whisper of heat rising from the coals. The 3 visitors understood immediately. Every man who spent winters in the mountains had experienced that fear, waking in the dark to a dead fire, fumbling for kindling with numb fingers, knowing that if you couldn't get flame going quickly, the cold would kill you before dawn. "Show us how it works," Levi said quietly. The winter of 1839 came early to the Bitterroot Mountains. By late November, snow already lay 3 feet deep in the valleys, and temperatures dropped below zero most nights. Josiah Mercer and Aaron Blackwell had established their trapping camp in a sheltered basin near a series of beaver ponds, ideal territory that had produced good catches throughout the fall season. Their cabin was typical of what trappers built in those years. It had taken them 4 days to construct using readily available pine logs notched at the corners. The walls were chinked with moss and mud. A stone fireplace occupied one corner, built with river rocks and clay mortar. One small window covered with scraped hide let in dim light during the day. The structure kept out wind and most of the snow, which was all they really needed. Aaron was 32 years old, originally from Vermont, and had been trapping in the Rockies for 6 seasons. He was competent, reliable, and even-tempered. He and Josiah had partnered for 2 years and worked well together, splitting duties without conflict. They had developed routines that made wilderness life manageable, including a rotation for night watch during the coldest months. Night watch wasn't about guarding against threats, it was about maintaining the fire. A cabin fire built for warmth rather than cooking needed feeding every few hours. Let it die to ash, and the interior temperature would drop to match the outside air within an hour. In extreme cold, that could be fatal. February 9, 1839, was Aaron's turn for night watch. The day had been brutally cold, with temperatures that made exposed skin freeze in minutes. They had checked their trap lines quickly and returned to the cabin by mid-afternoon. They ate a meal of dried venison and bannock bread, then settled in for the long night. Josiah took the first sleep shift, wrapped in buffalo robes on his sleeping platform. Aaron sat near the fire with a book he had carried from Vermont, a volume of Shakespeare's plays that he read by firelight on long winter nights. The fire burned steadily, crackling pine logs providing heat and light. Around midnight, Aaron added several logs to the fire. The wood was dry pine, which burned hot but fast. He should have used a mix of pine for heat and oak for lasting coals, but the oak supply was running low and they had been conserving it. The pine logs caught quickly, flames dancing high. Aaron returned to his reading. The warmth of the fire, the long day of cold work, and the late hour combined to make him drowsy. He told himself he would just rest his eyes for a moment. He would hear the fire dying down. He would wake up and add more wood. He didn't wake up. The pine logs burned through in less than 2 hours. The fire collapsed to coals, then to ash, then to nothing. The temperature inside the cabin began dropping immediately. By 3 in the morning, it was below freezing inside. By 4, it matched the outside temperature of 26 below zero. Josiah woke just before dawn, something feeling wrong before he was fully conscious. The cold hit him immediately. He could see his breath in the darkness. The fire was completely dead, not even embers remaining. He called Aaron's name. There was no response. Josiah buried Aaron on a hillside above the beaver ponds 2 days later. The ground was frozen solid, and digging the grave required building fires to thaw the earth, section by section, a process that took most of a day. He marked the site with stones arranged in a cairn and spoke a few words he thought Aaron would have appreciated, though he was not a religious man, and the ritual felt hollow. He stayed at the camp through the rest of winter, finishing out the trapping season alone. The work kept him occupied during daylight hours, but the nights were difficult. Every evening when he built up the fire before sleep, he thought about Aaron sitting in that same spot, warm and comfortable one moment, dead the next. The randomness of it haunted him. They had plenty of firewood. The cabin was sound. Aaron had simply fallen asleep at the wrong time. Josiah found himself waking multiple times each night to check the fire, unable to trust that it would keep burning. He would add wood at midnight, then wake again at 2, then 4, never sleeping more than a few hours at a stretch. By March, he was exhausted from months of interrupted sleep, but alive. When spring arrived and the beaver streams opened, Josiah traveled to the rendezvous gathering where trappers met to trade furs and resupply. He talked to other mountain men about fire management, asking questions that most found strange. How often did they wake to tend fires? Had they ever had fires die completely during the night? What techniques did they use to make fires last longer? The answers were consistent. Every trapper woke at least twice each night to feed his fire during winter. Most woke 3 or 4 times. A few claimed they could make a fire last 6 or 7 hours with careful banking, covering the coals with ash to slow the burn. But even they admitted this was unreliable. If the wood was too dry, it burned too fast. If it was too wet, the fire would smolder and die. Wind coming down. A chimney could scatter carefully banked coals. A log rolling off the pile could expose the coal bed to too much air and burn through the fuel supply in an hour. Some trappers built enormous fires before sleeping, hoping the sheer mass of burning wood would last until morning. This sometimes worked, but was dangerous. Cabins caught fire when overloaded fireplaces sent sparks into thatched roofs or wooden chimneys. The large fires also consumed vast amounts of wood, requiring constant cutting and hauling that exhausted men during the brief daylight hours of winter. Others simply accepted cold cabins. They relied on heavy furs and buffalo robes, sleeping in conditions barely warmer than outside. This worked until it didn't. Men died from exposure in their own cabins more often than anyone wanted to admit. Josiah realized that summer that no one had solved the fundamental problem. Fire required constant human attention. Let that attention lapse for even a few hours, and the consequences could be fatal. There had to be a better way. Josiah spent the summer of 1839 trapping and thinking. He could not stop his mind from returning to the problem of fire management. During long days checking trap lines or processing beaver pelts, he found himself analyzing the nature of combustion, heat retention, and fuel consumption with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His thoughts kept returning to his childhood in Pennsylvania. His father, Daniel Mercer, had worked as a blacksmith in a small town near Philadelphia. Josiah had spent countless hours in his father's forge as a boy, watching metal heated and shaped, learning the rhythms of the blacksmith's craft, even though he had never pursued that trade himself. The forge fire was different from a cabin fire in fundamental ways. A blacksmith needed intense, concentrated heat that could be sustained for hours while working metal. The fuel was coal, not wood, and the fire required careful management of airflow to control temperature. Too much air and the coal burned too hot and too fast, wasting fuel. Too little air and the fire would die despite having plenty of coal remaining. Josiah remembered his father using a hand-cranked bellows to force air into the forge when high heat was needed. But for sustained work at moderate temperature, his father would adjust vents and dampers, restricting airflow to make the coal burn slowly and steadily. A properly managed forge fire could burn all day on a single load of coal, the fuel consumed gradually rather than in rapid combustion. The principle was opposite to cabin fires. Most trappers thought more airflow was always better. They built fireplaces with large openings and good draft, believing this made fires burn hotter. And it did make them burn hotter, but it also made them burn faster, consuming wood at rates that required constant replenishment. What if cabin fires needed less air, not more? What if the goal was not maximum heat, but sustained heat over the longest possible time? The idea seemed counterintuitive, but the more Josiah thought about forge management principles, the more sense it made. There was another element he remembered from his father's work. Coal was not the same as wood. Wood burned with flame, releasing its energy quickly. Coal could burn with minimal flame, glowing hot and releasing heat steadily over extended periods. A coal bed in a forge could maintain working temperature for hours without adding fuel, the existing coals simply radiating consistent heat as they were slowly consumed. Josiah had never seen anyone use coal for cabin heating. Wood was abundant in the mountains, and coal had to be transported from distant sources at great expense. But there was another option he remembered from Pennsylvania. Charcoal makers would take wood and burn it in oxygen-deprived conditions, converting it to charcoal. The process seemed wasteful, using wood to make a different fuel, but charcoal had properties wood lacked. It burned hotter, produced less smoke, and most importantly, it could maintain coal beds that lasted far longer than wood fires. By late summer, Josiah had formed a theory. If he could make charcoal from the abundant wood in the mountains, and if he could build a contained fire system that restricted airflow like a forge, he might be able to create a fire that burned for days instead of hours. Spring of 1840 arrived with unusual warmth, melting the mountain snowpack early and opening the high country for travel. Josiah spent the trapping season working beaver streams with focused efficiency, but his mind was elsewhere. He was planning experiments that would consume the entire summer, tests that other trappers would consider a waste of time and effort. In June, after selling his furs at the trading post, Josiah returned to his winter camp and began making charcoal. He had never done this before, but he remembered the basics from watching charcoal makers near his Pennsylvania home. The process required burning wood in conditions where oxygen was severely limited, allowing the wood to carbonize rather than burn to ash. He started by digging a pit 4 feet deep and 6 feet across. He filled it with split hardwood, primarily oak and maple, that he cut from the surrounding forest. He chose these woods specifically because he remembered his father saying dense hardwoods made the best forge coal. Pine and other softwoods burned too quickly and left poor coals. Once the pit was filled with wood, Josiah set it alight and let the fire establish itself. Then he covered the burning wood with a layer of green branches and leaves, followed by a thick coating of dirt. The covering cut off most of the oxygen supply. Smoke poured from gaps in the earth covering as the wood inside slowly converted to charcoal rather than burning completely. The process took 3 days. Josiah monitored the pit constantly, adding more dirt where smoke vented too freely, ensuring the burn remained oxygen-starved. If too much air reached the wood, it would burn to ash. If too little air reached it, the fire would die before completing the conversion. The balance required constant attention. When he finally opened the pit, he found roughly 40 pounds of charcoal from wood that had originally weighed over 200 pounds. The loss seemed enormous, and he understood why other trappers would consider this wasteful. You burned 5 pounds of wood to create 1 pound of charcoal. On the surface, it made no sense. But Josiah believed the trade-off would prove worthwhile. He spent the rest of June and all of July making more charcoal, refining his technique with each pit. He learned that covering the pit with wet clay instead of just dirt gave him better control. He discovered that hardwood charcoal was denser and burned longer than softwood charcoal. He found that larger pieces of wood produced more usable charcoal than small pieces, which often burned to ash despite his best efforts. By August, he had produced nearly 200 pounds of charcoal, stacked carefully in his cabin to keep it dry. Other trappers who visited thought he had lost his mind. Why spend an entire summer burning perfectly good firewood to create what looked like partially burned scraps? Josiah did not explain his reasoning. He simply continued his work, preparing for winter when he would test whether his theory about long-burning fires could actually work. Late August of 1840 brought cooler nights that signaled the approaching winter. Josiah began the next phase of his experiment, a phase that would require him to make a decision other trappers would consider insane. He was going to dismantle the perfectly functional fireplace in his cabin and replace it with something entirely different. The existing fireplace was built into the corner of the cabin using river stones and clay mortar. It had a chimney that extended above the roofline and drew smoke effectively. By frontier standards, it was a good fireplace. But Josiah understood that its design encouraged rapid burning. The wide opening and strong draft pulled air through the fire constantly, consuming wood quickly. He spent 2 days carefully taking apart the fireplace, salvaging stones he could reuse. Other trappers would have called this destruction of a valuable structure, but Josiah saw it as removing an obstacle to something better. His new design was based on forge principles adapted for heating rather than metalwork. He planned to build a circular fire ring on the cabin floor, positioned in the center of the room rather than against a wall. The central location would allow heat to radiate in all directions, warming the entire cabin more efficiently than a corner fireplace. He gathered flat stones from the creek, selecting pieces that were roughly uniform in size. He wanted stones he could stack in consistent courses, creating a circular wall approximately 3 feet in diameter. The diameter was deliberate. Too small, and the fire ring would not hold enough coals to burn for extended periods. Too large, and it would be difficult to manage and would consume too much fuel. The first course of stones was laid directly on the cabin's dirt floor in a perfect circle. Josiah used a length of rope tied to a central stake to maintain consistent radius as he positioned each stone. He fitted them tightly together, leaving minimal gaps. The second course was laid on top of the first, offset so that joints did not align, creating a stronger wall. The finished ring stood roughly 18 inches high, with walls 1 stone thick. The interior diameter measured 34 inches. Josiah lined the bottom with 3 inches of sand he had carried from the creek. The sand layer served 2 purposes. It insulated the earth below from direct heat, preventing moisture from rising into the fire ring, and it provided thermal mass that would help distribute heat evenly across the coal bed. The top of the ring remained open, but Josiah had collected a dozen flat stones of various sizes that he could position across the opening. These stones would serve as adjustable dampers, allowing him to restrict airflow and control how quickly the charcoal burned. It was the same principle as the vents and dampers on his father's forge, adapted to a simpler system using movable stones instead of mechanical devices. The construction took 3 weeks of careful work. When finished, the fire ring looked primitive but purposeful. It dominated the center of the cabin floor, a circular stone structure that other trappers would find strange and impractical. Josiah studied his work and felt confident he had built something that would change everything. December of 1840 arrived with heavy snow and temperatures that dropped below zero at night. Josiah had spent the fall months trapping and gathering additional firewood, though he needed far less wood than in previous years, since he planned to burn primarily charcoal. He had also used the autumn months practicing with his fire ring system, learning its characteristics through trial and error with small fires. Now he was ready for the real test. On December 7th, he loaded the fire ring with charcoal for the first time, with the intention of maintaining a coal bed for as long as possible. He filled the ring to a depth of 6 inches, using his best hardwood charcoal. He arranged the pieces carefully, placing smaller fragments in the center and larger pieces around the perimeter. He used pine kindling and wood scraps to ignite the charcoal, allowing the flames to spread through the fuel load. Once the charcoal was burning well, he removed all remaining wood and let the charcoal establish itself. Flames danced across the surface initially, but as the charcoal burned down and formed coals, the flames diminished. After 2 hours, the charcoal had converted to a glowing coal bed. This was the critical moment. Josiah used his iron rod to arrange the coals in a specific pattern he had developed through his autumn experiments. He pushed most of the coals toward the center, creating a dense core. Around the edges, he left the coals looser, spread in a pattern that looked almost like spokes radiating from a hub. Then he positioned flat stones across the top of the ring, covering roughly 2/3 of the opening. He left gaps where he could observe the coals and where minimal airflow could reach the fuel. The stones restricted oxygen supply dramatically compared to an open fire. The coal bed glowed steadily, producing heat that radiated outward. The cabin warmed quickly. By evening, the interior temperature was comfortable enough that Josiah worked without his heavy coat. He checked the coals before sleeping, added 3 small pieces of charcoal to the edges where the fuel had burned down slightly, and adjusted 1 stone to restrict airflow even further. He slept through the night for the first time in nearly 2 years. When he woke 8 hours later, the coals were still glowing. The cabin temperature had dropped slightly overnight, but remained far warmer than any previous winter morning. Josiah added a few more pieces of charcoal, stirred the coal bed gently to redistribute heat, and adjusted the stone positions. The fire continued burning. Through that first day, he checked it 3 times, adding small amounts of charcoal and making minor adjustments. By the second morning, the same coal bed was still producing heat. By the 3rd day, Josiah realized he had succeeded beyond his initial hopes. The coal bed burned for 6 days before it finally required complete renewal. During that time, he had added perhaps 15 pounds of charcoal total, compared to the 100 pounds of wood a standard fire would have consumed. The system worked exactly as he had theorized. The impossible had become real. January of 1841 brought the coldest temperatures Josiah had experienced in his 8 years in the Rocky Mountains. The thermometer he kept mounted outside his cabin door registered 30 below zero on multiple nights. During the day, temperatures rarely climbed above 10 below. The cold was relentless, the kind that made exposed skin freeze in minutes and turned breath to ice crystals before it could dissipate. This was the true test of his coal-burning system. Moderate cold was one thing. Extreme cold that killed men and animals alike was entirely different. If his fire ring failed during weather like this, he would likely die before he could revert to traditional wood-burning methods. The system did not fail. Josiah developed a routine that required checking the fire twice daily, once in morning and once in evening. Each check took approximately 5 minutes. He would observe the coal bed's condition, noting which areas had burned down and which remained dense. He added small amounts of charcoal to areas that needed fuel, typically 3 to 5 pieces per check. He stirred the coal bed gently with his iron rod, redistributing coals to maintain even heat distribution. The stone dampers required adjustment based on outside temperature and wind conditions. On the coldest nights, he opened the gaps slightly to allow more airflow and higher heat output. On calmer, warmer days, he restricted airflow further to conserve fuel. The adjustments were subtle, moving stones by inches rather than feet, but they made significant differences in burn rate and heat production. His cabin maintained a consistent interior temperature between 40 and 50 degrees, even during the worst cold. This was far warmer than any trapper's cabin he had visited. The difference was remarkable. He could work inside without heavy coats. He could sleep without piling on every fur and blanket he owned. His water bucket did not freeze overnight. Food supplies remained accessible rather than frozen solid. The fuel efficiency was equally impressive. A single coal bed lasted between 5 and 7 days before requiring complete renewal. Renewing the bed meant clearing out the accumulated ash, adding fresh sand if needed, and building a new charcoal load from scratch. Between renewals, he used approximately 2 to 3 pounds of charcoal per day. Over a month, this meant roughly 60 pounds of charcoal compared to the 300 or more pounds of wood a traditional fire would consume. In late January, during a particularly brutal cold snap, Josiah had an unexpected visitor. Ezra Dalton appeared at his door one morning, half frozen and desperate. Ezra's cabin was 12 miles north, and his fire had died overnight during temperatures that had dropped to 35 below. He had barely survived the night and had set out at first light to seek help at the nearest cabin, which happened to be Josiah's. Josiah brought Ezra inside, gave him hot coffee, and let him warm by the fire ring. Ezra sat silent for nearly an N.J. hour, simply absorbing heat and recovering from his near-death experience. Finally, he looked at Josiah and asked the question that would change everything. "Teach me how this works." Ezra Dalton stayed at Josiah's cabin for 3 days, recovering from his brush with freezing and learning the coal-burning system. Josiah explained every aspect of the technique, from making charcoal to building the fire ring to managing the coal bed. Ezra listened with the attention of a man who understood he was learning something that could save his life. The charcoal-making process was the first challenge. Ezra had never attempted it and found the idea of burning wood to create different fuel counterintuitive, but Josiah walked him through the logic. Charcoal burned slower and hotter than wood. It maintained coal beds that lasted days instead of hours. The initial investment of labor produced fuel that was far more efficient for sustained heating. They could not dig charcoal pits in January with ground frozen solid, so Josiah gave Ezra 40 pounds from his own supply to get started. It was enough for 2 weeks if managed properly. Ezra would need to make his own charcoal come spring, but the gift would keep him alive through the rest of winter. Building the fire ring was the second element. Ezra's cabin still had its damaged fireplace, but like Josiah, he would need to dismantle it and build the circular ring system. Josiah helped him gather stones from a creek that remained partially unfrozen. They hauled the stones back to Ezra's cabin on a sled, making 3 trips over 2 days. The construction took 4 days. Josiah supervised, while Ezra did most of the work, learning through doing. They built the ring in the center of Ezra's cabin floor, matching the dimensions of Josiah's system. They lined it with sand and collected flat stones for dampers. By the end of the 4th day, Ezra had a functional fire ring. Lighting and managing the first coal bed was the final lesson. Josiah showed Ezra how to arrange the charcoal, how to let it establish itself before restricting airflow, how to position the damper stones, and how to read the coal bed's condition to know when and where to add fuel. They maintained the fire together for 2 days until Josiah was confident Ezra understood the system. When Josiah returned to his own cabin, Ezra was a believer. Within a week, 2 more trappers visited Ezra's cabin and saw the coal-burning system working. Levi Ashford and Micah Sterling were both experienced mountain men who had struggled with fire management for years. They recognized immediately that what Josiah had developed solved a fundamental problem. By late February, both Levi and Micah had built their own fire rings. Josiah visited each of them, providing guidance and sharing charcoal to help them get started. Word continued spreading through the scattered trapping community. Some trappers remained skeptical, unwilling to invest the labor required for an after any other, unproven technique. But others, especially those who had experienced close calls with frozen cabins or who had lost partners to the cold, adopted the system eagerly. By spring of 1841, 7 cabins within a 50-mile radius were using variations of Josiah's coal-burning method. The innovation had taken root. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was collapsing by the mid-1840s. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in many regions, and fashion trends had shifted away from beaver felt hats towards silk. The economic foundation that had drawn men into the wilderness was crumbling. Trappers began leaving the mountains, heading to Oregon, California, or back to eastern settlements. But the cabins remained, and with them the fire ring systems that Josiah Mercer had pioneered. Settlers moving west discovered abandoned structures with strange circular brick rings on their floors. Some dismissed them as oddities, others recognized superior engineering and maintained the systems, learning through trial and error how to operate them effectively. The technique spread beyond its origins. Professional charcoal makers began supplying remote communities, recognizing a market among trappers, homesteaders, and prospectors who valued fuel efficiency. Trading posts started stocking charcoal alongside traditional supplies. The knowledge of how to build and operate fire rings passed from person to person, spreading throughout the northern Rockies and eventually into other frontier regions. The phrase Mercer fire became shorthand in some communities for the coal-burning system, though many people who used the technique never knew Josiah's name or the story of how he had developed it after watching his partner freeze to death. Innovation on the frontier often worked that way. Good ideas spread organically, divorced from their origins, valued simply because they solved real problems. Historians later estimated that the long-burning coal system saved dozens of lives over the 2 decades following its introduction. The exact number was impossible to determine because survival often went unrecorded. But accounts from the period included multiple references to people weathering brutal cold in cabins where fires burned for days without attention, providing warmth that meant the difference between life and death. Josiah himself left the mountains in 1853. He had saved money during his trapping years and purchased land in Oregon Territory near the Willamette Valley. He married a woman named Catherine, whom he met at a church social in Salem. They had 3 children and ran a small farm that produced wheat and raised cattle. He never returned to the Bitterroot Mountains. He rarely spoke about his years as a trapper, and his family knew almost nothing about the innovation he had developed or the lives it had saved. To his children, he was simply a farmer who had once worked in the fur trade, a common enough background in Oregon during that era. Josiah Mercer died in 1871 at the age of 62. He was buried in a cemetery outside Salem with a simple stone marker that listed his name and dates. There was no mention of fire rings or charcoal systems or the winter that had changed everything. But in the mountains he had left behind, cabins still stood with circular brick rings on their floors. Some were still in use, others sat abandoned, silent monuments to a technique born from tragedy and refined through obsession. They represented a truth about frontier innovation that transcended any individual story. The most valuable discoveries often came not from genius, but from necessity, not from education, but from determination, and not from seeking glory, but from simply refusing to accept that better solutions were impossible.